The flight attendant had always prided herself on her years of service in the skies. She had flown to dozens of countries and dealt with every type of passenger imaginable, but nothing prepared her for the arrogance of a new crew member who seemed to think he was above everyone else on board. She had seen many new hires over the years, but none like him. He was young, brash, and confident in a way that felt like a punch to the gut. She had spent years perfecting her craft and building relationships with passengers. But here was this guy barely out of his 20s walking onto the plane as if the world owed him something, as if he knew it all. He strutted into the cabin like he was the star of the show, throwing around meaningless industry jargon and acting like he had been in the business for decades. His eyes scanned the room like he was surveying cattle, and the worst part was that he didn't even try to hide it. He glanced over the crew like they were beneath him, as if they weren't seasoned professionals with decades of experience between them. He wore a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. But it was there. It was obvious to everyone in the cabin. The flight attendants exchanged glances. None of them said a word, but they all knew the same thing. They had seen this kind before. He didn't even greet her when he passed her in the galley where she was preparing for the pre-flight beverage service. She gave him a polite smile, but he barely acknowledged her. He was too busy adjusting his tie and checking his reflection in the polished surface of a nearby cabinet. She couldn't help but feel a flicker of irritation rise within her. It was as though he was above even the most basic courtesy. He was already creating an air of tension, and the flight hadn't even started yet. As the flight took off, the young man continued to parade around the cabin, making small talk with passengers. But it was obvious that he was doing it for show. He didn't genuinely care about anyone. He was simply trying to impress. As the flight went on, he began to interact more with the crew, but it was clear from the start that he thought himself better than everyone else. He made it a point to challenge her over trivial things, such as the best way to serve a drink or how to interact with the passengers, as though his opinion mattered more than anyone else's. When they reached cruising altitude, she found herself in the galley again, preparing a new round of drinks for the first-class passengers. She had been at it for years, and she knew the routine inside out. She worked quickly and efficiently. But when the young man approached and began making suggestions on how to do her job better, she had to bite her tongue. He suggested that the drinks be served in a different order, and raised his eyebrows as though expecting her to take his advice seriously. He even had the nerve to ask her if she knew who he was at that moment. Her blood boiled. She had heard this kind of arrogance from young staff members before, but it still got under her skin every time. The rest of the crew seemed to notice his behavior as well. A few exchanged knowing looks, but no one said anything. She didn't need them to back her up. She had worked with enough professionals to handle this on her own. But the young man was pushing his limits. Now he laughed when he asked if she knew who he was, and when she didn't answer right away, he raised his voice slightly, as if she was the one who had insulted him. She could feel the tension building, like a storm about to break. She simply turned away from him with a cool smile, her eyes never leaving the drink cart in front of her. She would not let him get to her, not yet. But she had made up her mind. She would deal with this arrogance in her own way. As the flight continued, the young crew member's behavior became more and more unbearable. He couldn't stop talking about his past career in the corporate world, as though it was the only thing that mattered. He spoke with an air of superiority, telling anyone who would listen about his achievements in business, as though the flight attendants were just stepping stones in his path to greatness. He made little effort to interact with passengers or assist the other crew members with their tasks. It was as if he believed his presence was enough to make the flight run smoothly without any real work being done. He strutted through the cabin with a smug grin on his face, completely unaware of the subtle but growing frustration around him. The flight attendants exchanged quiet glances every time the young man made one of his boasts, but no one dared to speak up. Everyone had learned long ago that in the air you had to keep the peace, no matter what, but the tension was palpable. and it was only a matter of time before it reached a breaking point. She could feel it in the air, the frustration building in every corner of the plane. The other crew members avoided him where they could, and when they couldn't, they gave him only the bare minimum of attention. His presence was like a constant buzz in the background, distracting from the calm rhythm of the flight. But no one dared to confront him. They all knew the drill: just keep quiet and get through it. But the flight attendant felt something stirring inside her, a quiet rage building with every word he spoke, every moment. He disregarded the value of experience and teamwork. She could tell he thought he was untouchable, and that no one would ever challenge him. He acted as though his past in the corporate world made him more important than the years of service and dedication that the flight attendants had under their belts. His cocky attitude made her want to lash out. But she held back. There was a way to handle this. She knew it wasn't the first time someone had come onto a flight with that level of arrogance. It was just a matter of how she would make him understand that respect wasn't something you could demand. It was something you had to earn. The young man continued to speak as though everyone was listening, but all of the crew had tuned him out. He began to notice it, but he chose to ignore it, not understanding that his attitude was starting to wear thin on everyone around him. In the midst of the flight, the young man made another mistake. He had been assigned to help serve drinks in the first-class cabin, but instead of asking the experienced flight attendants for guidance, he arrogantly assumed he knew better. He moved too quickly, spilling drinks and interrupting conversations between passengers, as if it were all a game to him. When he bumped into an elderly passenger spilling wine on her blouse, he didn't apologize or offer to help. He simply muttered an excuse and walked away. When the flight attendant noticed the interaction, her heart dropped. She had seen passengers treated poorly before, but this was different. This was a lack of care and respect for the very people who were paying for the service. It was clear to her that the young man had no understanding of the responsibility that came with his position, no understanding of how to make passengers feel valued. He didn't even seem to realize how badly he had messed up. As the passenger glared at him, he simply brushed it off, as if the woman didn't matter. It took everything in her to remain calm. But she knew this was the moment. She had been waiting for. This was the tipping point. She had tried to ignore it, but now she couldn't anymore. She had to do something. She had to make him understand that the job wasn't about him. It was about the passengers. It was about the team. And above all, it was about respect. She watched him walk down the aisle, oblivious to the damage he had caused to his reputation with one simple gesture. She knew how to handle it, without raising her voice, without making a scene, but in a way he would never forget. As the flight carried on, the young man continued his arrogant ways, oblivious to the mounting discomfort around him. He seemed to have no awareness of how his behavior was affecting the crew or the passengers. He walked down the aisles, making casual remarks to the first-class passengers, as if they were all just characters in his own personal show. He spoke about his previous job with so much pride, yet he didn't seem to realize how out of place his boasting was among a team of experienced professionals who had worked tirelessly to get to where they were. The flight attendant watched his every move, knowing she couldn't let this continue. She had seen enough of his antics and his disregard for the passengers who trusted the airline to take care of them. Her patience was running thin, but she knew she had to bide her time. The more he spoke, the more he revealed his true character, and she began to understand just how deep his arrogance ran. The young man clearly had no idea who he was dealing with. He thought he could walk in and command respect simply because of his past experiences, but he didn't understand that respect was something you had to earn, not demand. She had seen far more accomplished people than him, with far less arrogance. She had worked with some of the best in the business, people who knew how to handle pressure with grace, and humility, people who put the passengers first and never allowed their egos to get in the way of their duties. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't just about him disrespecting her. It was about him disrespecting the entire team. The other flight attendants were just as seasoned as she was, and they had all worked hard to build the reputation of the airline, to maintain the level of service they were known for, and yet here he was strutting around as though everything was beneath him. It was a slap in the face to the whole team, and to the passengers who were trusting them with their safety and comfort. She could feel the weight of it growing with every passing minute, and she knew she couldn't let him continue to think he was invincible. It was time to teach him a lesson he would never forget. She decided to take a different approach. Rather than confronting him directly, she would use his own arrogance against him. She knew that in his mind he had already put himself on a pedestal, and had no idea how much he still had to learn about this job, about respect, about how to serve passengers with genuine care and professionalism. So she began to subtly steer the conversation in ways that would make him feel small. Without ever saying a word, she casually dropped hints about her own experiences, flying to exclusive destinations, and serving some of the wealthiest and most influential people in the world. She made sure he overheard every word without ever directly addressing him. She spoke about how she had been on flights where things went wrong, and how the key to success was staying calm, and focused how being able to anticipate the needs of the passengers was a skill that took years to perfect. She could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes each time she spoke, as though her words were getting under his skin. She knew he was trying to act like he didn't care, but she could tell he was beginning to feel the weight of her experience. She was doing this not to humiliate him, but to make him realize just how much she had yet to learn. He was so wrapped up in his own arrogance that he couldn't see the bigger picture, but she could, and she wasn't about to let him get away with treating the team and the passengers with such disregard. By the time they were approaching their destination, she could see the shift in him. His cocky demeanor had begun to fade, and the young man seemed to be second-guessing himself. He was no longer strutting around the cabin with his usual air of superiority. He was quieter, more reserved, almost as if he were realizing just how much he had underestimated the flight attendants and their expertise. And as they began preparing for landing, she knew the lesson had started to sink in. She had planted the seed, and now it was only a matter of time before he would truly understand what respect meant. As the flight reached its final stages, the young man seemed to be in a completely different mindset than when they had first taken off. He was no longer the confident, brash figure that had strutted onto the plane with arrogance, dripping from every word now. He was quieter, more reserved. His movements were slower, as if he were suddenly aware of how much he had misunderstood about this job, about respect and professionalism. The flight attendant watched him closely from her position in the galley. She could see how his posture had changed, how his eyes avoided hers. Whenever their paths crossed, he was no longer walking with the same swagger. Now he seemed unsure, like he was reconsidering everything he had said. And done throughout the flight, she could see the shift in him, and knew that her subtle approach was working. The rest of the crew had noticed too. They had been silently observing his behavior since the moment he boarded, and now they could see how his arrogance was beginning to crumble. His cocky smile had disappeared, replaced by a furrowed brow and a quiet uncertainty. There was no more bragging about his past job, no more dismissive comments directed at the flight attendants or passengers. He had fallen silent, and in that silence, the flight attendant could feel a sense of satisfaction rising within her. It wasn't about him admitting he was wrong or apologizing for his behavior. It was about him realizing the truth on his own without anyone needing to say a word. As they began preparing for landing, the young man seemed to be in a state of quiet reflection. The flight attendant could see him glancing at the other crew members, as if measuring them, reconsidering his initial judgments about their worth. She could sense that he was starting to grasp the importance of teamwork and humility, something he had clearly lacked when he first boarded the plane. He was beginning to understand that this job wasn't about him or his past accomplishments. It was about working together as a team to provide the best service possible to the passengers, and that required respect for everyone involved, no matter their role, no matter their experience. But the true test came when they started the descent into their destination. The plane had hit some mild turbulence, and the crew was instructed to ensure passengers were securely fastened, and seated. The young man had been assigned to assist with the final check of the cabin and make sure everything was in order. He moved quickly, but with a nervous energy about him, no longer the confident air he had once exuded. Instead, he fumbled with the seatbelt signs and hesitated when speaking to the passengers, as if unsure of what to say. She watched him work from the corner of her eye and couldn't help but notice how he kept glancing back at her, almost as if seeking approval or guidance. For the first time since the flight began, he seemed uncertain of himself. His usual arrogance had been replaced by a quiet vulnerability that she hadn't expected. At one point, he accidentally dropped a drink tray and looked to her for help. Without saying anything, she simply moved over to assist him, showing him how to handle the situation calmly and without drama. She didn't criticize him, she didn't make a scene, she just guided him through the task and let him learn from it. There was no need for words at that moment. Her actions spoke louder than any lecture could ever have done. She knew that sometimes the best way to teach someone a lesson was to show them how it was done instead of telling them. She gave him the opportunity to see what true professionalism looked like without ever making him feel belittled. As they neared their destination, the young man seemed to have finally realized just how much he had underestimated everyone on the crew. He no longer walked around with his head held high, as if he were above everyone else. He had begun to take on a quieter, more humble demeanor, and the flight attendant knew the lesson had been learned without a single harsh word spoken. She had taken her time and let the situation unfold naturally, and now the young man would carry that lesson with him for the rest of his career. The young man was now a shadow of the person he had been when the flight first began. The confident smirk he had worn so proudly had long since disappeared, replaced by a quiet introspection that seemed to settle over him with every passing minute. He moved through the cabin more carefully. His posture had changed from one of arrogance to one of restraint. He interacted with the passengers more thoughtfully and no longer made unnecessary comments about his past job or his supposed expertise. He had stopped trying to prove himself, and for the first time since the flight began, the flight attendant could see the weight of humility beginning to sink in. She knew the game was almost over, but there was one final act to complete, and she was ready for it. As they neared their destination and began their final preparations for landing, the tension on the plane seemed to fade as the crew settled into their routine. The passengers were safely strapped in, and the young man was now diligently checking every row to make sure everyone was comfortable. He was focused on his task, but there was something different about him now. He was no longer rushing through his duties, eager to finish. He was taking his time, ensuring that everything was in order, and doing it with a level of care he had not shown earlier in the flight. He wasn't just doing the bare minimum anymore. He was actually paying attention to the little details, the things that mattered most to the passengers and the crew. As she watched him move through the aisles, the flight attendant couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet satisfaction. She hadn't been looking for an apology from him, nor had she expected any grand gesture of humility. All she had wanted was for him to understand the value of the work they did and the importance of respect for others, especially those who had been in the business long enough to know the ropes. But what truly struck her was the fact that he seemed to be learning on his own. She hadn't needed to say a single word to him. Since the flight began, her actions, her subtle hints, her quiet guidance had done the job for her, and now the young man was standing on the edge of a lesson he would never forget. As the plane began its descent and the seatbelt signs illuminated once again, she found herself walking down the aisle to make sure everything was in order. She had already completed her own checks, but she saw the young man fumbling with the seatbelt signs once more, and in that moment she knew she had to give him one final nudge. She quietly walked over to his side, and without saying a word she adjusted the seatbelt sign with a smooth motion. Her hand brushing lightly against his as she did so. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes to him. In that instant, he looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and realization. He didn't say anything at first, but she saw the change in him, the subtle shift that told her he understood her lesson loud and clear. He'd have been expecting something grand or dramatic. He had been expecting to be told off or humiliated, but instead all he received was a gentle reminder of the standard he should have been holding himself to. She hadn't needed to yell or call him out. She had simply led by example, and in doing so she had helped him see just how much he had to learn about the job. And the people around him, the young man, took a deep breath, as if he were finally breathing a little easier, and she knew the weight of his earlier arrogance had been lifted off of him. He was no longer the same person he had been at the start of the flight. As the plane touched down and the seatbelt sign was turned off, he moved to assist the passengers with their departure. But this time there was no cocky smile on his face, only a quiet sense of duty. He moved with purpose, his actions more deliberate and respectful. And when the flight attendant caught his eye as they stood at the door, greeting passengers, he gave her a small nod of acknowledgement. It was a silent recognition of the lesson she had taught him, one that would stick with him long after the flight was over. As the passengers began to disembark, the young man was no longer rushing through the process. He had slowed down and was helping with a level of care that had been missing earlier. His hands no longer fumbled with the trays or drink carts. He moved with a quiet focus. And when he smiled, it was genuine. It wasn't the arrogant grin he had worn when he first boarded, but a smile that reflected the humbling experience he had gone through during the flight. The flight attendant observed him from her position near the exit door, watching as he assisted the passengers with their belongings. He was no longer the young man who thought he knew it all now. He was someone who had learned the true value of respect for others. The lesson had taken root in him, without any grand display, without a single word being spoken between them. It was all in his actions now, and she could see the difference. As the last of the passengers made their way off the plane, the crew began their own process of tidying up and preparing for the next flight. The young man had continued to work diligently. He had helped with the luggage and checked the overhead compartments to make sure nothing had been left behind. He moved efficiently, but with a newfound respect for the job, and his colleagues, the flight attendant, could see that he was no longer taking things for granted. He wasn't acting like a rookie who was above the small details, but a professional who understood that every task mattered, no matter how insignificant it seemed to others. She had taken her time, showing him how to be better, how to serve with humility, and now it was paying off. She could tell that his attitude had shifted, and while he hadn't openly acknowledged the change in himself, she knew that he had felt it. It was in the way he interacted with the other crew members, now no longer dismissing them with a wave of his hand, but actually listening to their advice and working alongside them as equals. He was beginning to see the value of teamwork and collaboration. He had been so eager to prove himself before, but now he was more interested in learning from those around him than impressing them. She could sense the shift in the way he carried himself. He was no longer focused on himself, but on the work and the people he was serving. That was the most significant change of all. The flight attendant moved to finish her duties, and as she did so, she passed him once more near the galley. He was bent over checking the equipment with care, and for the first time since the flight began, she saw a true sense of pride in his eyes. It wasn't the pride of arrogance, but the quiet pride of someone who had worked hard and learned something valuable. The flight attendant smiled to herself. She didn't need his acknowledgement. He had already proven to her that he had understood the lesson, and that was enough. It wasn't about teaching him to be humble for the sake of humility. It was about teaching him to respect the job and the people around him, to understand that no matter where you come from or what you've done in the past, the real measure of a person is how they treat others and how they approach the work at hand. As the crew gathered their belongings and prepared to leave the aircraft, the young man approached her. He hesitated for a moment, and then looked up, meeting her gaze with a sense of quiet sincerity. His voice was softer, now more humble than it had been before, and he simply said, "Thank you for showing me how to do this." The words were simple, but they held weight. She nodded, acknowledging his gratitude, but she didn't say anything in response. She didn't need to. Her actions had already spoken louder than words ever could. He had learned exactly what he needed to learn without her needing to push him any further. Without any confrontation or direct criticism, he had found his own way, and she was content knowing that he would carry that lesson with him for the rest of his career. As she left the aircraft and headed for the crew lounge, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride herself. She had done what she came to do, not through confrontation or dramatic speeches, but through quiet confidence and patience. She had shown him the value of respect, the importance of humility, and the power of leading by example, and she knew that from this day forward the young man would approach his work and his relationships with others in a completely different way, and that was the most rewarding part of all. As the days went on, the young man's transformation didn't go unnoticed. The other crew members, who had been watching him closely during the flight, began to see the difference in his attitude. His behavior had shifted from one of arrogance to one of quiet professionalism. He no longer boasted about his past job or spoke down to his colleagues. He interacted with them in a way that showed genuine interest and respect for their experiences. He no longer dismissed their advice, but actively sought it out. When he wasn't sure about something, he took the time to listen and learn instead of arrogantly assuming he already knew everything. The crew members, who had been wary of him before, now saw him in a new light. They were impressed by how quickly he had changed and how humble he had become in such a short amount of time. The flight attendant watched this shift with a quiet satisfaction. She knew that her approach had been the right one. She hadn't tried to force him into submission or humiliate him. She had simply led by example and let him learn through his own experiences. She hadn't needed to lecture him or point out his mistakes. She had let his own actions speak louder than words, and in doing so she had given him the space to realize his own faults and grow from them. What mattered now was that he had truly understood the lesson and had made it his own. The young man wasn't the same person who had first boarded the plane with a sense of superiority and entitlement. He had become someone who respected the job and the people around him, who understood that being good at this job wasn't about how much you could brag about your past, but how well you treated others and how seriously you took the responsibility of ensuring the passengers were safe and comfortable. As the young man continued to prove himself to the rest of the crew, the flight attendant began to see the positive impact of his change. Not only was he more respectful and helpful to his colleagues, but he had also started to receive positive feedback from passengers who had noticed his shift in demeanor. They appreciated the way he took extra care in assisting them, the way he greeted them with a genuine smile and engaged in polite conversation without making them feel like they were just another task to check off on his list. He had finally understood that the job was about people and not about impressing anyone with your past accomplishments. It was about providing the best service you could and making sure everyone felt valued and respected. As time passed, the young man began to take on more responsibilities. He no longer needed as much guidance from the more experienced crew members. He had learned the ropes and was now able to handle situations with confidence and professionalism without the need for constant supervision. The flight attendants, who had initially been skeptical of him, now trusted him to handle important tasks. On his own, he had proven himself time and time again and had earned their respect in return. They began to rely on him just as much as he had come to rely on them. The team had become stronger because of his willingness to change and his desire to learn from those around him. The flight attendant watched all of this unfold with a sense of pride, not just because she had been a part of the young man's journey, but because she knew that her quiet influence had made a difference. She had given him the space to grow and had helped him realize the importance of humility and respect In the workplace, without ever demanding anything from him, she had simply let him learn on his own terms, and in doing so had created a lasting change not just for him, but for the whole team. The ripple effect of that one lesson had gone far beyond what she had ever anticipated. One evening, after a particularly smooth and uneventful flight, the young man approached the flight attendant. As the crew was preparing to head off the plane, he looked at her with a sincere expression and simply said, "I just wanted to thank you again for everything you did for me." He wasn't looking for validation or approval. He wasn't expecting anything in return. He simply wanted to acknowledge her role in his transformation. The flight attendant smiled and gave him a nod of acknowledgement. There was no need for further words. She knew he understood now. And that was all that mattered. The young man had learned the value of respect for others and had become a better person for it. She had done her part. And now it was time for him to continue on his journey in his own way. As the weeks passed, the young man continued to excel in his role, and his reputation within the crew grew. He was no longer seen as the arrogant newcomer who thought he knew it all. Instead, he had become a valued team member, someone who was respected for his humility and his willingness to learn from others. His progress had been remarkable, and even the most seasoned flight attendants were impressed by how quickly he had adapted to the demands of the job. He had proven that it was possible to change and grow when given the right guidance and opportunity. The flight attendant, who had been the catalyst for this transformation, continued to work alongside him, but now their dynamic had shifted. She no longer saw him as someone who needed to be taught, but as a colleague who could hold his own in any situation. He had earned her respect, and the respect of the entire crew. They had all watched him grow from a cocky and dismissive individual into someone who took his responsibilities seriously and treated his colleagues and passengers with the utmost professionalism. It was a quiet but powerful shift that had rippled throughout the entire team. One day, after a particularly smooth flight where everything had gone perfectly, the young man found himself reflecting on how far he had come. He stood by the window of the crew room, looking out at the tarmac with a quiet sense of contentment. He had been on countless flights since that first trip, but none of them had felt quite the same as that first one. The flight attendant's words and actions had left a lasting impression on him, and as he looked back on it all, he couldn't help but feel grateful for the lesson she had taught him. He had come into this job with a chip on his shoulder, believing that his previous experience had made him better than everyone else, but he had learned the hard way that humility and respect were the true markers of success in this field. He had learned that the best flight attendants were not those who bragged about their past or sought validation from others, but those who put the passengers first and treated everyone with dignity and kindness. As he thought about all of this, he smiled to himself, knowing that he had become the kind of flight attendant he had once dismissed, the kind of person who valued the job for what it was and not for the accolades it might bring. He knew that he still had a lot to learn and a long way to go, but he was no longer in a rush to prove himself. He had learned to enjoy the journey, to appreciate the small moments, and to give his best in every situation without needing to be recognized for it. He had come to understand that the real reward was in doing the work with integrity and seeing the positive impact it had on those around him. That afternoon, as the crew prepared for another flight, the young man found himself walking alongside the flight attendant. Once again, this time, he didn't feel the need to boast or seek approval. He simply walked with her in silence, knowing that they shared an unspoken understanding. They had both been through something together, something that had changed him, and that would stay with him for the rest of his career. As they made their way to the plane, he turned to her with a sense of quiet gratitude and said, "I just wanted to thank you for everything you did for me. It wasn't just about that one flight. It was everything you showed me since then." The flight attendant smiled warmly, but said nothing she didn't need till she knew that her work was done, and that the young man had finally understood the importance of respect, humility, and professionalism. She had shown him the way, but it was his own effort and growth that had brought him to this point. As the plane took off and the crew settled into their routine, the young man felt a sense of peace. He no longer carried the weight of arrogance or self-doubt. He had found his place among his colleagues, and in his own mind he had learned the lessons that mattered most, the ones that went beyond skills, or experienced the ones that made a person truly great at their job. He knew he had come a long way from that first flight, and as he looked around at the team, he now felt a deep sense of belonging and gratitude for everything that had brought him here. And as the plane soared through the sky high above the clouds, the young man knew that this was only the beginning of his journey, and that every flight would offer a new opportunity to grow and continue learning in a way that he had never expected. When he first stepped on board that fateful flight, it was a reminder that no matter how far you think you've come, there's always room to grow and to become better with each passing day.